Hi. Today we're going to be talking about how to improve your general reading ability for cars. But the catch is we're going to be doing so using non-AAMC material. So this video is perfect for you if you are maybe saving your AAMC material or saving your Jack Weston material for later in your study journey. And similarly, this video is also perfect for you if maybe you haven't started studying yet, but you're still looking to get ahead or maybe just become a better scholar or future professional in general. So this video is going to be short. We're going to go through 3 concrete ways, and I'm going to give you examples of what I did along the way of how to become a better reader overall. And yes, while this will certainly help you in the cars section, I think mostly, there's also ways that you can improve your reading ability in general to help you in the other sections as well. So when we go through, I'll talk about some ways that you can improve that. And I'm just excited to be sharing these tips with you because I think a lot of students want to somehow get a jump on the studying before they actually start using the AAMC material. With that being said, let's jump into our first tip. So our first tip is challenging yourself by reading from other complex sources. So, we're looking at non-AAMC sources in this video. So here are a few of my suggestions of sources and what exactly you can look to glean from them. And similarly, if you're really strong at reading in some areas, but maybe not so strong in other areas, maybe some of these resources and the reasons behind them will strike a chord with you. So the first resource, or the first 2 resources, I guess, that I want to talk about are the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And while I use those 2, big brand names, you can really use any type of reputable news source with the emphasis being put on reputable. So for example, you probably shouldn't be reading, I'm trying to think, you probably shouldn't be reading some random article you found online. That's probably not going to be super reputable and the writing might not be super strong. Basically, we just want to really make sure that when we're reading, we're choosing something that's going to be challenging and that the rigor of the writing is going to match up with what we see on the AAMC, the test, the MCAT. So the reason I propose those 2 is because they're going to expose you to material that you may not be comfortable with right away, and also because it may not be related directly to healthcare or science or anything like that. So as you know, in the cars section, there will be some passages probably related to healthcare or general sciences, but there's also passages about philosophy and about history and about pop culture. And in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, you'll be exposed in all of these areas. So it might require you, to pick on the sections that maybe you're not familiar with. Let's say you're not super familiar with banking. Maybe you read an article about how the banking industry is becoming revitalized, or one about the transportation industry. The main point here is that you are going to become more comfortable reading something that you may not have seen before, that you don't have a ton of outside knowledge about. And then the goal here is to make sure that you comprehend it within a few paragraphs. And this also just has, I want to mention, the added bonus of you will become much more worldly because you are engaging in all of these different spheres that maybe you weren't engaging in previously. But at the same time, you're also going to be super prepared and knowledgeable for your medical school interviews. So if they ask you about something you're passionate about outside of healthcare, what your interests are, maybe one of these articles that you read will become one of your new passions or interests. Or similarly, if you're reading an economics article and it happens to be about the finances of universal healthcare, that could be really important in the interview process, and it'll show schools that you're a really well-rounded candidate. So that's our first resource. The New York Times or Wall Street Journal, once again, this can be really any reputable news source. And it has to be written preferably because the MCAT will be written. And you're not going to be, watching the news on TV and hearing those types of voices. So my personal strategy on this one was, and I didn't do this specifically for the MCAT, I'm just going to put that out there. I didn't start studying this long ago, but it really helped me when I challenged myself with material from Time's 100 Best Novels of All Time. So they have a list on their website. If you just Google that, it'll pop up, and it's basically 100 novels. Most of them were written in the 1900s, some in the early 2000s, and they're all by really renowned and incredible authors, and they're really great pieces of literature. And I found that this countered reading news sources like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal really well. because number one, you get used to different types of writing styles. So for example, while the news might have been a little bit shorter and to the point, some of these books weren't necessarily super short and to the point. If you consider, for example, Lord of the Rings, that's a very long book that keeps going and going. Very interesting, but at the same time, it'll also build up your stamina, right? For when you're actually reading something, let's say you get lost or you might not understand what you're reading, it teaches you to keep going and how to understand the material. So that's kind of one added bonus of reading the Times 100 Best Novels of All Time. Another thing that I really found helpful with this list was some of these books are a little bit older, which, take that for what you will. For me, it was just interesting to see a different style of writing. I found often that the pace or the subject matter was very different from what I was reading in the news or online or that type of thing. So that really challenged my horizons, and I felt that I had a better understanding of historical writing and maybe philosophy or character building. And I found that came really helpful for those sections, but then also for the pop culture sections there's a lot about movies and books and that type of thing. And it was just helpful to have just a general idea of that industry. And then also, the third thing that I kind of really enjoyed and I found helpful about reading that list of the 100 best books of all time is that some of these books, as you read through, I haven't read them all yet, but at least some of the books that I've read so far, some of them are very dense and very confusing and very closely resemble AAMC passages. And the two books that come to mind right away, if you're looking to really challenge yourself, is Catch-22 and then A Clockwork Orange. So both of those books, authors are brilliant, but the writing style is not always the most clear or direct at points. And this reminded me of some of those really dense philosophy passages, those passages, right, that from sentence to sentence, it might not make a lot of sense, or they might be really confusing and overwhelming. But when you look at it on a paragraph or a page or a novel level, it does make sense. So these were really great exercises in just making sure that I was able to read at a higher level than just words. And it also taught me that I need to, not focus on the confusing bits, and that sometimes it's best just to keep going. And while you're doing this, you'll be building your vocabulary. You'll be building your ability. Your ability to synthesize arguments and understand them, and also evaluate them. And overall, you'll just increase your reading comprehension as you try to, go up and meet this new level of writing that you're encountering, possibly for the first time, and then you'll also encounter on the MCAT. So that was my first strategy, right? Reading from sources that were not AAMC in terms of the news and the Times or just general novels. Like I said, I specifically use the Times list of the 100 best novels of all time, very easily Googleable, but you can really read any reputable source that will give you good writing. The second recommendation I have for you in terms of improving your overall general reading ability is taking advantage of any research-based classes or experiences that you have in order to read research papers themselves. So many of the experimental passages on the AAMC and the non-CARS sections, many of them are excerpts or some type of revised, version of a paper. And they have results sections. Some of them will talk about experimental design. Some of them will talk about conclusions that are being drawn or the materials and methods, right? And the best way that you can understand that is by reading research papers about this beforehand. So when you go into the MCAT, the first time that you're reading a research paper, a boiled down excerpt of it, is not in that context. So one thing that I found really helpful in my personal strategy was that I was in a research lab during my undergraduate career, and I was around the time of my MCAT. So when I was studying for it, we did a weekly journal club, and when it came my turn to pick papers, I would try to choose a paper that was related, but outside of my scope of expertise. And the way that this helped me is because it challenged me to be able to understand, once again, these sometimes really dense papers about subjects that I don't necessarily know, and it made me become a lot more familiar with reading those acronyms and reading those experimental techniques and not getting all fixated up in what is this, what's going on, and just more focusing on the results or the outcomes and the place those had in the experiment. So you'll be exposed to a lot of foreign subject matter and in a style that you might not be comfortable with, but I guarantee you that this will help you to learn to pull out the important information in a somewhat high pressure environment if you choose to time yourself reading these papers. but it'll just generally help. And one thing that I also personally did was that I did concept mapping for some of these really dense papers. And that helped me because, as you know, I'm a huge concept mapper, both on the actual MCAT and while studying. And just being able to practice these concept maps on more material, you know what they say, the more practice, the better. So that's the second strategy, taking advantage of research-based classes and reading lots of research papers. And once again, you do not have to be in an actual research class or in a research lab for this. You can really do this on your own. The reason I say is that sometimes it's a little bit easier to start with something that you do know a little bit about and then branch out from there. But it's not bad practice just to jump, cold feet into a subject that you don't know too much about. That's what it might be like on the MCAT exam. For some experimental techniques or some experimental results, that type of thing. And then my third strategy is challenging yourself to make your own AAMC CARS passage. And this might sound really intimidating at first. Some of those passages, like we've been talking about, are pretty intense. But there's 3 different ways that you can really do this. So the first way that might come to mind is you could literally write one from scratch. About something that you're passionate about. So if you do have a research interest, you can practice writing a psychology research or a psychology passage about research that you've done. And when you're going through, think about, which tables and which results am I going to include? Am I going to include my materials and methods in its full extent? Like, how am I going to present this information to the reader in a very logical way? And by having this author's perspective and having written a passage, and I also recommend writing out questions and answer choices, you'll understand from the author's perspective how they're trying to present this information to you. And then as a reader, you'll be more knowledgeable and you'll know where to look for things. And you might also be able to develop some type of instinct about where these question stems might lead. For example, like the central thesis, right? If we're talking about what's the purpose of this, maybe not the central thesis, what's the purpose of this experiment, of this specific, one step of this experiment? Well, if you're writing a paper, right, you're going to want to say, I'm doing this experiment because I want to discover X, Y, Z. And having that in mind when you're reading through a passage and you get a question stem about that, then you'll say, okay, well, I started with that because I wanted to introduce my reader to it. So maybe this author did as well. And most of the time that is true. So you'll kind of get that insider's perspective. So that's one way you can do it. If that sounds a little bit too daunting to you just to write something from scratch, that is totally okay. Another thing that you can do is find any type of writing that you've done in the past, whether it is a 20-page essay, whether it's a 2-page book report, something like that, anything you've written in the past, and just reflect on what you've written. And this might sound kind of, like reflection, you're like, okay, but the key to this is making it active. So in reflecting on it, we're going to want to take some of the most common question stems that we see from the AAMC. So like, what's the central thesis? What does this piece of evidence support? Is the author's argument strong? What is their main conclusion? Any of these typical question stems. And what we're going to do is you're going to apply it to your own writing in the past. And it's okay if you wrote this yesterday. It's okay if you wrote this 10 years ago. It doesn't matter. The key here is you being able to look back and see where the evidence is located and see where the answers are located. And this is really helpful because once again, it can make you become a better writer. Certainly, if you realize I don't have a central thesis, well, then, okay, maybe you might want to add one. But just in general, you'll become a little bit more comfortable with the structure of an argument and the structure of an essay, similar to the ones that you might see on the actual MCAT. And the final thing that I suggest you do, once again, if that's a little bit too daunting or maybe you don't have any, final writing pieces that you've written or on hand, the last thing that you can do is go back to that first tip that we were talking about, looking in the New York Times, looking at the Wall Street Journal or any type of novel, and trying to find a suitable piece of literature. So you choosing a section that you think is really important. Typically, this is towards the beginning or the end, or even if you can find a short essay, that's even better. Anything like that. And instead of doing the writing of the passage, you're going to write the questions and the answer choices. So a lot of the questions you might be able to pull just from memory, that type of thing. We were talking about the central thesis. What are the conclusions? But you can also get really creative and challenge yourself with the questions that challenge you personally the most. So for example, if you have a lot of trouble with Roman numeral questions and you're wondering like, how does the AAMC make these so tricky and come up with so many odd combinations that throw me off my feet, then maybe you want to try writing a Roman numeral question. And in your answer choices, you'll decide what the Roman numerals are. You'll decide what the combinations are. And then I strongly encourage you to take the test of your answer choice and go through and say, well, this answer choice is correct. That's why I put it down. And it's correct because of line X, Y, and Z in the passage. And then I chose to include these 3 incorrect answer choices because I thought that somebody else might misconstrue this, or because I focused purposely on the wrong area, something like that. And in the practice of simply being able to come up with the correct answer choice and write that question and see the logic behind it, but then also see the logic behind the incorrect answer choices, you'll be able to be a little bit more aware and critical of your own test-taking abilities and your own ability, for example, to eliminate answer choices. So just kind of taking note when you're writing that, like how do you try to mislead yourself or others? And then what parts of the passage or what themes do you mainly draw on? Can be really helpful. So one example might be a lot of questions about purpose of the passage tend to come from that first paragraph, whereas a lot of questions about conclusions or what are the next steps tend to come from the last passage or last paragraph of passages. So having that in mind when you're writing your questions can help you become a more critical test taker because you know what you're looking for and, more importantly, where you're looking for it, as well as what you're not looking for. So these are 3 really great strategies. I used all of these at one point or another when I was preparing for the MCAT. So just to recap, we talked about challenging yourself to find material from non-AAMC resources in terms of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I personally read some of the books on the Times list of the 100 best novels of all time, and just really challenging yourself to become familiar with reading things or articles or essays or novels that you might not be 100% comfortable with, and then kind of working backwards and becoming more comfortable as you go. So that was the first strategy. And then our second strategy was taking advantage of any type of research-based class or research experience or simply Googling research papers. It doesn't matter what they're about. The most important thing is that you're becoming familiar with the structure and you're becoming more comfortable finding out which information is important and which information is not important. If you like concept mapping, this is a great way to practice without burning up any AAMC material. And like I said, it'll make you more knowledgeable in general. I know that one thing that I struggled with in the beginning was trying to read through the Jack Weston passages, or they were Khan Academy back then, but reading through those questions and not being able to, get over the fact that I don't know what this hormone is, and I don't know what this protein complex is, and I don't know what this kinase is. And that was a little bit scary for me, but by forcing myself to read papers that I didn't really know much what was going on and just trying to challenge myself to figure out what the main outcomes and the main ideas were, I became a lot more comfortable and kind of letting go and realizing that I don't need to know everything in order to answer some of these questions. So that was the second strategy with research papers. And then the last strategy is challenging yourself to create your own CARS passages. And we talked about how there's different levels and strategies of doing this. If you're comfortable just diving in, you can just go for it, write your own passage about something you're passionate about, questions, answer choices, all of that stuff. If that's a lot, maybe just reflecting on an essay you've already written and focusing more on the questions and answers. And then lastly, looking at somebody else's essay that they've already written and challenging yourself to become an AAMC test designer and figuring out what questions you'd ask. And in doing all of this, our goal is to try to get the author's perspective, either from the passage or the AAMC test designer's perspective from creating those questions. You'll know what to look for, you'll know what not to look for, and you'll also know where to look for it. And the goal is just to become more comfortable with how these questions are designed and then how to go about answering them. So all 3 of these strategies are really awesome. Like I said, you don't have to wait until you've already started studying for the MCAT to start doing some of these. You can start doing them as early as you want, high school, middle school, whenever you're feeling comfortable with. And the goal here is, yes, to see score increases and your better comprehension for CARS and the experimental sections on the MCAT. But overall, it'll make you just a better reader in general, which is important if you want to go into healthcare.